Thank you for the pre-applause. So when I talked to Jim about this topic, these are the questions he sort of laid out, and I guess I can quickly answer them and say, yes, agriculture can be efficient, and yes, it can be sustained. There are obviously different approaches in order to do that. To begin with, I just sort of like to start with a quote that not intended to scare anybody, certainly not my original quote, but those of you that have read Charles Fishman's book talks about the second modern water revolution that we're on the cusp of achieving or having happen. The first one being the one that delivered safe, abundant, clean, cheap water to us. And that obviously is now something that is going to be different in the future. These things, he states, will not be present in the same three as a group. That is, there may be abundant or cheap water. It may not be safe. There may be safe or cheap water. It may not be abundant. So agriculture is really one of the entities that has to play a role, and I believe is willing to play a role in staving off or being making this revolution, if you will, less intense. Just to kind of begin with where I stand on the issue, I obviously work at a land-grant university. We consider food production one of the paramount issues of our time. And many of you have seen or have heard this kind of a slide which talks about how much food we have to continue to produce in order to satisfy and contend with our growing population and the demands on food that are going to be placed on us by the third world. Let's just suffice to say it's a lot of food. And with that said, as the cities continue to grow and agriculture has to keep up, we have Captain Obvious here, for those of you that know the Hotels.com character, telling us that food is critical to our population. So thank you, Captain Obvious, getting that issue out of the way. Accomplishing this feat of satisfying these demands will require innovative uses of technology, labor, people, policy, and natural resources. And so right now, as Jim and others in the room are involved with, the statewide dialogue is dealing with how agriculture, and the question he laid out is exactly accurate. How can agriculture contribute water to address the existing shortages? And I'm just going to sort of lay out what I perceive, and I think others perceive as the sort of basic pathways, and these pathways, and these are in agriculture, conservation versus efficiency. One of my tasks in putting this talk together was to distinguish between the two and talk about these two issues as strategies and what kind of tactics and operations choosing one or the other unfolds. They're obviously used interchangeably, and I think this interchangeable use leads to confusion in some circles. And I think defining these terms is important to convey to society or the public or what have you, to inform the societal views of what irrigated farming does. What irrigated farming does is it supplies high-quality, abundant food to feed our growing population, of course. So let's just start out by taking a look at conservation, which in a nutshell I break down by saying conservation is about reducing crop, field, farm, water demand. And I'm going to kind of walk through this. I know your minds may start going immediately, quickly to what about different crops and alternative crops and all these kinds of things. Just sort of bear with me. But to break it down, all things being equal, a conservation approach is about reducing some form of yield or demand from a farm or a field. And there will be a downward effect on yields for similar crops. So let's take our cornfield, for instance, and talk about fallowing at the start, which is obviously a strategy that's been used to great effect to address short-term water issues. It also has agronomic value, as we talk about at our university. Our irrigated water supply delivers water to the cornfield, and that water is then divided, of course, between the consumptive use and the return flows that originate from that diversion. A fallow field, having reduced the crop, leaves a portion of the consumptive use in the river, presumably leaves most of the consumptive use that would have originated from the water right in the river. But what I always like to caution is that there will always be a need to have some kind of a cover crop or some way to protect that soil in place. Because the consumptive use was never delivered, or the water right was never delivered, the saved water, if you will, remains in the river also. So in other words, the diversion never happened, so you're bypassing the field. But what we run into often is this issue of a soil moisture deficit, which has attendant effects on soil systems and ags in the crop itself. And of course that can be ameliorated in some way. The additional fallow grassland or additional crop requires costs. So it's really not always it's not always the best approach considering what you're trying to do, because there's additional costs that go with fallowing, and every time something is growing on that fallowed field, there's additional soil moisture forbearance that occurs. But of course we use it because it's very effective, and it is a conservation approach. It's about reducing crop water demand. Right there I kind of want to make sure that as I go through these slides you sort of orient yourself to the plus and minuses. We use fallowing to great effect to produce reduce disease cycles, improve soil health. We can restore or retire marginal lands. Shifting the crop mix may be a benefit of that system. But without proper transition, the soil conditions can worsen. And I'm sort of leaving out the bigger economic questions here because we have a panel later that will talk about these things in context, and farmers know these issues off the backs of their hands better than I do. But these are the kind of agronomic and water issues that I think are important. So moving away from fallowing, however, look at a different conservation approach. This is another example. Take the irrigated water supply and everybody's favorite crop here, alfalfa. Same application, probably obviously applying more water for alfalfa. Consumptive use return flows. In a deficit irrigation system, what you're essentially trying to do is reduce the consumptive use of that crop and somehow leave a portion of that in the river, having not diverted as much. Presumably some portion of that return flow would remain in the river also. But so for a given yield goal, the conservation approach alone results in doing less. And this is where I kind of want to have the basic message here, is that a conservation approaches, by and large, are about doing less with less. I'm not making a statement about whether this obviously can be compensated, those losses to the farmer, but ultimately conservation does less with less. It can encourage better and more targeted irrigation practices. With less water, you tend to be more efficient in your applications, but with less water, you would expect to see lower yields. We encourage using targeted irrigation to critical growth stages. However, it's a little riskier, and in fact, the idea of conserving consumptive use and whether it can be transferred has challenges in water court that I probably would only mention because I'm not a water lawyer, but my understanding is that these issues haven't fully been worked out. Plus, it's sort of like shaving the consumptive use off the top, which presents a little bit more challenges to the farmer rather than a concept like split season irrigation, which I think has merit. And what that is essentially is the same kind of irrigation, but what you're essentially trying to do is you're shaving off the consumptive use vertically. That is, you're expecting at the beginning of the season you'll irrigate, or at some portion of the season you'd have irrigation, and then you would cease the diversion and essentially allow the alfalfa to survive on its own. That leaves water again in the river, but it's constantly this issue of conserving consumptive use. There are questions about whether and how this approach leaves a soil moisture forbearance that the farmer has to bear going into the next year. And I'm fortunate to be working with the River District to study this issue. And I just want to keep pointing out that these issues can all be ameliorated economically, but the take-home message here is you are doing less with conservation. So you're not producing as much, all things being equal. Maybe administratively easier because the diversion simply doesn't occur. As I've already mentioned, there's a soil moisture forbearance under these deficit irrigated or split irrigated or non-irrigated alfalfa fields. You run into soil health issues, in particular nematodes, forage quality. So let's talk about efficiency then, to make this contrast. And if I haven't already kind of established the point about conserved consumptive use, efficiency is about reducing water losses. And what you're talking about is essentially converting the potential of the water into real, actual work. Those of you that do pump curves and things know about efficiency. You've got your power and you've got your brake horsepower. You're converting potential work into real work, and the plant does essentially the same thing. Under a good efficiency paradigm, the effect on yields should be negligible or even positive. So the basic definition quantitatively is it's the ratio of volume of water which is beneficially used to the volume of irrigated water. And I had a slide that went into all kinds of other definitions of irrigation efficiency, but let's just suffice to say right now we're talking about potential and reality, and you want to maximize potential. Basic irrigation concept, of course, kind of moving from left to right on this slide. This is your soil matrix. What you're trying to do with efficiency is essentially prevent that little drop from occurring. You're essentially, I like to say, putting water on with an eyedropper, so to speak, would be better than waterboarding the crop. You're trying to keep the soil, however, happy enough that it doesn't get into the wilting point area, the area where the crop is stressed. So you're always sort of moving between these two, the ceiling and this floor, and that requires a much more elegant kind of an attention-oriented management system that many of the farmers that I work with are prepared for, because of the fact that essentially with an efficiency system, the goal is that same need, that same crop need delivered to the field, but the goal, of course, is to get the gains out of the potential return flows. And I mean, I realize this introduces those questions about return flows, and I think that people that are smarter than me and more lawyerly than me and more policy-oriented than me are working through those questions, but this is essentially the layout, is that the saved water, which never goes to the field, stays in the river. The goal, of course, here is that there's no attendant or should not be an attendant effect on yield. So what I like to call it is doing the same with less. Same yield, less leakage. Yields can improve, labor costs tend to be lower, which is why a lot of people move towards the system. There's obviously a capital improvement in the system. It introduces the opportunity to change the crop mix. So as we start moving away from other crops, the opportunity exists to alleviate that economic baseline by growing a more growing a commodity crop like onions or something. But again, those introduce risks that farmers are gradually willing to take on. I like to point out too that farmers operate in a context of a market, and to great annoyance, I hear many people just talk about, well, they're using all this water, and then of course people in this room don't speak like that, but there are folks that well-meaning that sort of have that perception, and I always. My friend Steve Schrock said yesterday, if every day was Halloween, farmers would grow pumpkins all the time. It operates in a demand that exists, a real demand. They know how to do it. They know how to do it well. And as society demands beef and milk, we grow alfalfa to supply that demand. So in order for this shift to occur, we're probably going to expect eating patterns to occur as well, which gets back to perhaps my Captain Obvious point, but it's a good point to make, I believe. What I also like about efficiency systems is they allow the farmer to buffer drought and climate change, like we heard Jeff Lucas talk about. You have more flexibility in your application rates. You can create the soil condition that you want more effectively, more often, so the crop is happier and can survive without as much stress. And that, of course, is the goal. The big thing, of course, is there's a high cost to these things. There's a learning curve. There's system pressure requirements, and I commend Dave Kanzer for the work he's doing to bring funding to this area to address some of these issues. I felt like I didn't need to go into a lengthy explanation about the kinds of efficiency systems that are out there, because I think many people are aware of that. But what I can essentially say is that they're entirely possible. Many farmers are willing to take these risks, but they need reasonable incentives to do so. And if you're willing to kind of go along with my hypothesis here that food production has a sort of a special place in our society, then incentivizing food producers to continue doing that, I think has sound logic to it, and defensible logic, and arguable perhaps, but it's a line of reasoning that I think has a nice thread to it. So expected irrigation efficiencies, many of you have seen some form of this table. Moving away from our furrow systems towards our efficiency systems is ultimately, it was a big trend in farming, and it conforms to a trend that we see happening in every other sector of technology. And general furrow systems are, quote, 50% efficient. That is, they convert 50% of the potential water or the potential energy or the potential crop producing capacity into crop itself. Other systems are better. They do it differently, they do it better, and they convert more of that potential. Consequently, less water is needed to be diverted. Something I actually snagged this slide just the other day because I thought you might find this interesting, and this is sort of my room to grow slide, which kind of shows the upper Colorado and on down, but the upper, especially the western slope, has not really taken off with the pivots, and there's reasons for that to get into the pressure issues and the kinds of crops and the growing seasons that we have. But my point is there's room to grow here, and I think that's exciting. One thing that I work on a lot is simple irrigation scheduling, and I like to contrast low-tech, high-impact versus high-tech, low-impact. And I say low-impact from the high-tech side only because it takes a while to have these things propagate. More immediately, there are strategies that on even our simple furrow systems that can do the job. And I don't think we're talking about wholesale retirement of ag. I think what we're talking about is what role can ag play in the sort of 10 to 20% range, not the expectation to fill the whole deficit. And I think that's a reasonable statement. Simple irrigation scheduling, though, is about asking the soil where it happens to be at any given moment and having the farmer react back to that. So it's essentially not on it's a new form of irrigation that John Harold tells me about the guys that used to put their lawn chairs in the ditch and water was so short you'd wait, you'd sleep there and wait for your feet to get wet and boom, you get up and start irrigating. This is something akin to that, except now the signal goes to your phone and not your feet. So you're essentially oscillating again between these two conditions, keeping the crop happy, maximizing your potential. These are simple tools, and I think they're easily deployable, and we're working in this area currently, and I'll show you some data that shows the deployment of these tools. Why is efficiency really such, how do you promote it? How do you promote the irrigation scheduling? And this is a slide that I like to show. It just is irrigated corn, which I guess the pointer doesn't work very well, but essentially the high point in that curve is where you're maximizing your ET for the crop. So keeping the soil happier more of the time is the goal of farming, and you're achieving the higher ET and consequently the higher yields. That's something to be aware of, but it's a real agronomic principle. Similar, this is just 2007 data that essentially shows the same thing. Interesting to point out, though, that over-irrigating actually can lead to a diminishment. Why is that? Crops don't like wet feet. Nothing really likes wet feet, but crops especially don't like wet roots and waterlogged systems, and this introduces other problems as well. So it's to our advantage to kind of move at the top from both sides. It's not advantageous to over-irrigate. To make the contrast, and this is sort of the final one of these little blocky type slides, the issue as I look at it is really where are you trying to get that water from? And as I mentioned, how that water stays in the river I think is another, obviously a huge question, probably the bigger question than the one I'm addressing. But doing less with less under conservation or doing the same thing with less? Two different contrasting pathways. Two different strategies leading to different tactics and different operations. I will point out, of course, this is where it gets a little bit more complex. Simultaneously practicing both is very possible. New crops, however, bring new risks. And this is sort of an example. I've heard the term Vanguard Cropping, sort of moving into as eating habits change or cropping habits need to change, and maybe a farmer uses one that wants to maximize more of his water in certain places. You retire that one field, and you've got maybe an opportunity to use that water to on less land to grow more of a different kind of crop and keep your economic baseline the same, to keep farming so you can continue to live in your community, so you can continue to send your kid to the same school, and all the outcomes that derive from keeping farming whole. Different yields, doing something different with less is really kind of a paradigm that I see happening, and I think will continue to happen, and I think is worth encouraging to happen. It introduces profitability as an issue and all the other things that come with it. Whenever I get a new phone, there's a period where I can't even turn it off or turn it on or make it stop ringing, and imagine trying to do that with your livelihood. And I will say every time I submit any USDA people in here, every time I submit a proposal for an alternative cropping system, I always get the response, well, is there a market for this? And I think that markets emerge in response to people and their demands, and so I think there's a whole kind of a circuitous discussion there. It's an easy point to make, but if we don't start encouraging these kinds of things, we're never going to know how to do them well. So to kind of go through some examples, alfalfa cropping in California, I just want to talk about simple irrigation scheduling and what's possible on the ground right now. And I think I've already explained that the pivot systems and all these sorts of opportunities exist, and they're trends that will continue to occur. But what can we do immediately? A lot of good work has been done in California, and telemetry is going to be a big part of this. These are alfalfa check bays in this rectangle over here on the left side. That's how they irrigate in those areas. And essentially what they've got are these simple little triggers that feed back to a field sensor somewhere, and that sensor goes right to the phone. It can go to a solenoid. It can go to some other device that tells the farmer to shut off the system. It's easy to install. There's obviously issues. It's like a Bluetooth system on steroids, basically, where you're trying to get your mouse to talk to your computer, and it's kind of the same concept, but it reflects the trend in technology that we see with everything becoming smaller and more efficient and whatnot. But the point being is it's being done right now, and the savings are quite impressive. This is from their data down in either the Palo Verde or the Imperial, California, though. Starting out, most producers were asked, well, where would you set your check? Like this is where the birds stop flying or the gophers stop moving, or they're moving away, or they do it visually. They asked them to do that, and then they used it's a very simple kind of equation to determine where the check should basically be, and they were able to take the tailwater reductions from 30-ish%. You can sort of see where those dashed lines are, 25 to 35. Down to 5 to 10% of the applied water. So I think those are the kinds of realistic numbers that can be done. And this was no attendant effect on yields. So again, doing the same thing with less. Locally, we've got our partners here, and I'm glad. It feels like the minute I showed up, I was given about 4 jobs to do in the Uncompahgre. This is a drip versus furrow field that we're studying on onions. You can see just the side-by-side kind of study. We've got the telemetry system out there, and we're essentially monitoring a water budget for the field, and it feeds back to the base station, and trying to understand how much water is being used on each system. This is the top and the bottom. Those of you that know how to understand those kinds of checkbook method of irrigating, what's coming in, what's coming out. So this is ongoing this year, first season. And the data look quite good. I had a friend out there just last night reading meters, so this is up to date. I guess the pointer doesn't work terribly well, but if you kind of just follow the chart over to the right, you'll see that we've got lower I can't see my own slide, so that's why I'm just struggling. Over far to the right, the actual ET is measured locally from the Coagmet system, and there's a back check I did just to adjust for the yield. But essentially what you're wanting to look at is the actual ET moving from right to left, the actual ET, the irrigation, and the rainfall, basic numbers we've measured. And the big conclusion, though, is down there in the paragraph where we talk, I'm reporting that the furrow systems, the sprinkler system, contrasting 51% efficiency on the furrow systems up to 70% efficiency where we are now on the sprinkler pivot. So these are good demo projects to show locally, to see how people here are doing it. The drip system was so impressive. I actually called the farmer and I checked my numbers several times because I couldn't figure out how he had done this so well. This actually exceeds the typical efficiency you'd expect for a drip system. But he's just a terribly good farmer. In our side-by-side drip versus onion field, we've got basically a twofold increase in efficiency. It's twice as good, moving from 50 to 90%. And then the question that farmers largely are interested in is, how is this improving my profitability? So the irrigation water efficiency, which is kind of your crop per drop, is right there in the blue. You can see that it goes up. The yields go up on the furrow system versus the drip system. It's about a 20% increase on yield. I am working out the economics on that, and I'm excited to report that as soon as I have a little time. Onions, of course, come in different sizes, and so we also reported that we get a different kind of a species mix. The smaller onions don't have to fight quite as hard, just like in any ecosystem. So the mediums tend to grow. They're more easily satisfied and less stressed. So they're not competing with the colossals and the jumbos. But the good news is the colossals and the jumbos also. Well, the colossals were almost 3 times greater, and those are some of the big money makers. The jumbos stayed the same, and the mediums, there's obviously use for those, but they were able to grow as well. So again, very encouraging local data, and we're going to continue to do this and document it and hopefully use it to show farmers, in particular, get the farmer who's done this some credit, and hopefully I can rope him into talking about his skills. And this is my slide that I have no transition for, essentially. It's just basically supposed to kind of blow you away and make you think about what in the world are we headed towards. What I'm trying to point out, though, is that where we are right now with technology is reflective of existing trends, but we don't really know where things are going to go. We do know that we're going to have to produce more food than we've ever produced before. And whether we're building skyscrapers filled with cows or something else, there's always going to be a need for farmers and food production and water, consequently. So becoming more efficient with water really appears to be the big trend. Another thing I just like to point out is some of the big, you can measure fields individually, but some of the bigger companies now are working towards broader scale scanning of remote sensing issues to look at how evapotranspiration is occurring across broader swaths. And this is an example from the Arkansas Basin, where right along the corridor you can see this, just the color ramp is blue, wet, red, dry. This kind of technology is possible today to understand evapotranspiration rates and make adjustments and have these kinds of pieces of information feed back to diversions or other water sources, reservoirs and laterals and those sorts of things. So we're moving in that direction already. So just final thoughts, I would say, 20 years ago, did you think you'd be carrying a phone in your pocket? What about a computer? We used to think the cloud was just water vapor. So underlying this technology is a societal trend towards efficiency, and it will continue to occur, and it's something I think we should support in the long term. I was fortunate to have some interns this summer there were 3 young men that by the time they were done with the summer, they were thrilled with the idea of, and I'm hoping they hold true to this, because otherwise my statement will be inaccurate in 10 years, but they were thrilled with the life of farming, and they were interested in the idea of putting their efforts into this kind of endeavor. All their work, all their future will happen in the context of new eating patterns. But the next generation of farmers will have to be more efficient and more tech-driven, and this is a reality to anybody that knows the transition in tractors and how they've occurred. We're just now talking about things in a different spectrum. And of course, the final big statement I want to bring back to this concept of in the next 50 years, we have to produce as much food as we ever have in history. And I think that's somewhat of a sobering thought. So as ag plays its role, I think my perspective, and of course we have a panel with farmers later, but they're generously willing to play that role. But this is a reality that exists outside of the context of ag. This is a societal reality. And I think that reality has to be factored into some of our big decisions. And with that, I'm done, and I'll happily entertain any questions.
Questions? Oh, yeah, there's one on the aisle.
Yeah.
So he'll have a mic, so you don't have to repeat it.
You bet.
Of course, your talk was on efficiency, partially on efficiency in agriculture. What about efficiency for the homeowner?
Is that the question? Okay. I just want to make sure. Most people don't have concise questions. It's a big context. Fair point. And in fact, in some of the other work I do, I encourage the same use, same technology for landscape irrigation. The same principles hold true. Some of those questions, some of the efficiencies are out of their control. You buy the products that you can buy, or you use the products that the landlord has in your house. But I'll just be quick in the answer that I say, I think those tools should be, and in fact, I know that in some counties, there are cost-sharing activities that will help you pay for either more, quote, efficient lawns, doing the same thing with less water. That is the sameness being having a lawn that produces property value that doesn't look, trashy. Programs that will cost share those activities. And also, I encourage widely people to focus and use irrigation scheduling. We have a big program at CSU for that. I do challenge my colleagues. I always ask, well, how do you set your timer? And a lot of people say, well, I set it for 60 minutes. And I just say, I wish I could get you to set it with soil moisture. But that's absolutely the direction we need to go. Good question. Who's asking the question?
Kathleen.
Okay.
Kathleen. Yeah, go.
Okay, so I thought the slide about the onion efficiency and the additional yield after the difference between furrow and drip irrigation methods was really interesting. Did you look at the economics or the cost of converting from furrow to drip and how that would play in? I see the yield is higher, but I'm sure there's a capital cost.
No question. I'll have that data for you. The interns were busy collecting the enterprise budgets, and I was actually just getting the yield data done last night. Yes, I did look at it. I'm excited to report it. You're absolutely correct. There's a note on that system that needs to be paid for. I think one of my other points, and maybe part of the dialogue, is how that payment should be structured. Is that you can get money for that through EQIP and other programs to do those conversions to some extent, and the farmer has to pony up some of their own, but I'll just quickly answer and say, yes, I have it, but I don't have it right now. I'm excited to show it, though.
Another question.
Frank, I saw Frank with it. Oh.
Right behind you, Mike.
When you say that eating patterns will likely shift, what are you thinking?
Well, I'm reporting not only my own perceptions here, but data that's been reported. I recently picked up there's a Robert Glennon's book. You look at some of the food and or FAO, UN data. I think because some like beef, for instance, as those kinds of livestock and whatnot become more expensive, it's reasonable to assume that people can't afford those things, that they'll move towards some other protein source. And it's just a trend we see happening broadly across perhaps not as much so in the United States, but certainly in the third world. You always hear about these new kinds of crops that, people, my wife wants me to eat quinoa more, and I'm slowly acquiring a taste for that. But it's a protein source, I'll put it that way, but that's my own perception, is that it's happening in my own household, so somewhat by force.
Great. One last question? Oh, one more. Karin.
Benefits for the soil that I've just heard reports of that can actually fix not just nitrogen but carbon, as well as moisture retaining benefits. Have you looked at any of those soil amendment possibilities?
Well, so yeah, I haven't looked at those, but I can just speak briefly. Of course, any crop fixes carbon. If it produces root matter, in green manure, we plow it in, it fixes carbon. That's what they do. And then nitrogen, of course, with the legumes. So I'm not sure what the context of that is, but you're thinking of additives that enhance that activity. I don't know much about them. I know there are always companies that want to sell you those sorts of things, but I'd be hesitant to speak about them in a more specific sense. I have colleagues that can do that, though.
Great. Well, thank you so much.
You bet.
One more question.
Okay.
Nutrient concentrations. Have you looked at what the source is coming into a field as compared to what goes out, and in relation to a lot of the water quality issues that I think agriculture faces?
Let's just take an example. Nitrogen in irrigation water, or some other, like selenium, micronutrient, that natural additions of nutrients or unnatural, or fertilizer, I should say.
I guess our problem is fertilizers. We constantly hear that ag is promoting nutrient concentrations that are not in line with a lot of the water quality rates we've got in Regulation 31 here in the state.
Understood. Yeah, so I can answer that question, and we're working on a project with the Selenium Task Force, or sort of somehow funded. I'm still understanding how all that gets paid for. But, the same principle holds, is that less tailwater, less loss, comes with less water quality. It's a mass balance issue. So I can safely say that encouraging efficiency does encourage water quality improvement. We're not looking at that specifically in our proposal, although in my projects currently, but that data is fairly abundant, and that's really the conclusion they come to, is as we become more efficient, the nutrients that are there will be retained by the crop and be used to grow, and less would be left behind, or would leave the field.
Thank you.
You bet.